Thank you for joining us this afternoon on this webinar. We're talking about tackling the PPA drug reimbursements, some hints, some tips, some strategies. We wanted to put on this webinar today. We have lots of conversations with our clients on a yearly basis. As part of the accounts preparation and the accounts meeting that we do. And a lot of those conversations are around how the practice is performing, whether it be dispensing or personally administered drugs income, what profit margins they are making. What we're finding recently, profits are starting to drop. There's increased pressures on the workplace, cost of drugs going up, changes in staff, general increase in that workload on a day-to-day basis. So we thought we wanted to kind of put on this session today to provide perhaps some reassurance that you're doing everything you can, but hopefully you'll walk away with some really positive tips and some strategies that you can put into practice on a daily basis. So my name's Louise Dean. I'm a partner, one of the medical partners at Larkin Gowan, and I am joined today by Richard and Harriet from Ash Lane Consulting. Ash Lane was set up back in 2012 to provide that really personal service to GP practices. Their team has got that primary care specialist skills in dispensing, clinical system coding, GP finances, looking at prescribing. They work with practices like we do on a day-to-day basis to really help them improve that profitability around their drugs. We've worked with Ash Lane quite a lot over the last few years. Certainly, we've seen clients who have really benefited from their service, and certainly getting up to sort of five-figure returns from the work that's been carried out. There is a question box within your panel. We will do we will do a question and answer session at the end. So please, any questions that you think of during the next hour, pop them into the question box, and we'll try and cover off as many as we can over that Q&A session. If there's any that we just don't get to, we will have a copy of the questions so we can follow up with you afterwards. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Richard, who will take us through the main presentation. So just bear with me a moment while we swap over the slides, etc., and hope that the technical aspects are on our side.
Great, Louise, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So thank you for the introduction, Louise. As Louise mentioned, we've been doing this for over 10 years. Our team has grown. This remains central to what we do. Anything we can to help our practices be in control of their drugs claims and their drugs payments. It's a full-time job. Our team has grown, and I'm pleased that Harriet's with me today to help field your questions. I really want questions as we go, but please just note them into the chat, into the Q&A, and we'll go through those at the end. I'm going to press on because we've got so much to cover. For those of you who haven't met us before, then, well, that's probably because we don't do much advertising. We kept very busy just because of all of the positive referrals we get from our clients and from accountants such as Larkin Gowan. It's great because you know, your accountant can see what's happening in your figures, they can see the problems, but then they need solutions to help you reverse declines in profits and so on. And that's where we can help. And we now provide services to over 300 practices up and down the country in relation to their drugs payments. So yeah, we're here because your drugs profits are under pressure. So I want to explain why that is and then what you can do about it. It really comes down to three things: ensuring everything is claimed, ensuring everything is paid, and then managing your suppliers. They're all equally important. There's an awful lot to cover. So what I've done is I've selected some of the specific things you can take action on today. So I'll cram as many of those in as I can, so that you really can make an immediate improvement. But yeah, please do keep asking questions though of anything that I may have missed or you want to find out more about. And in the time available, we'll answer as many of those as we can. Now, I am keen to know who's out there. So I've got a few quick questions for you. So what we're going to do now is just ask you a couple of quick questions just to find out who's on the webinar.
So for question 1, 41% of the practices joining us today are prescribing only, Richard, and 59% are dispensing practices.
Thank you, Louise. I couldn't see that, but that's very interesting. The majority are dispensing. That's great. That's no problem. Next question.
93% no. So
okay.
A huge captive audience for you here.
Oh, good. Okay, that's fine.
So 58% are in practice management, 26% classed as finance, 5% classed as clinical, and 11% as other. So no one classes themselves as a FP34 admin. So over half are practice managers.
Okay, that's good to know. Yep. I mean, the information I'm going to provide you with is relevant to all of those roles, so that's good.
So this is looking at what their worries are around FP34 claims and PCSE drug payments. Okay, so 56% from those results, people are worried about not claiming for everything. Which, yeah, I think that's a common question we get asked. Do you have a list of things we can claim? 31% is reducing drug profits, so about a third. Yeah, I'd say that stacks up with what we're talking about. And then 13% not knowing if they've been paid correctly. So interestingly, it's not potentially that they don't have the time to check. It's just, I guess, that oversight and making sure their knowledge is up to date.
Okay, great. All right, thank you for that. Right, well, right, so that's good to know. I've got a picture now of who's out there. Interesting about the dispensing practices, that's absolutely fine. I shall probably spend a bit more time talking about dispensing than I was planning to, but that's no problem. Okay, so just check you can still see my screen, shout if not. So the first thing I want to cover then is as Louise introduced, your drugs profits are under pressure, they're declining. This applies to both dispensing practices and prescribing only. So just to be really clear then, when we talk about drugs profits, I'm keeping it very simple. I'm just taking the drugs payments that you receive, and the drugs payment appears on a statement from PCSE and looks like that. So it's an amount of money. It splits out the cost of drugs and the professional fees, but we just take both of those together. For a dispensing practice, there is also a deduction, but that's for the prescription charges that you collected. So it cancels itself out with the prescription charge receipts. So that's what we're talking about, the amount of money you get from PCSE as the income compared with the drugs costs. And that's just the cost of the drugs. It doesn't include the bags, it doesn't include the electricity or the staff costs, it's just the cost of the drugs. And then we look at it as a percentage, and that tells us the margin. Now, years ago, 40 or 50% would be quite normal, and that was enough margin for everybody to be very happy, but also for you to get away with things being not perhaps perfect, because even if you were making a few mistakes, then you'd still have enough margin to leave a surplus and to have a profit at the end of the day. But increasingly, we are seeing that declining. And I have to say now, if everything is going absolutely perfectly, we're really only looking at a target of sort of 25 to 30% as your gross profit margin on your drugs. So if you haven't done so already, I would really encourage you to look at what yours is. Speak to your accountant, speak to Louise, find out what it is. It's a really good indicator of the health of your commercial activities in relation to your drugs. If it's less than 25 to 30%, then there's definitely room for improvement, but you first need to understand what's gone wrong. It's very hard to know how to fix this because there are so many contributory factors that impact on your drugs profits. So let's consider what's happening in a typical practice or some of the issues that can occur. Well, you're seeing patients throughout the month, and all of the clinicians are involved. At the end of the month, you generate a claim, which is the FP34 claim, and you send it off. For most practices, that's the last they think about it. But it's 2 months later that you're paid, and before then, your claim has gone to prescription services, and then to PCSE, and then, yes, finally you're paid. And as I mentioned in the example, all you see is an amount of money. So it's good to be aware of some of the pitfalls and some of the issues that can creep in. Well, it comes down to the fact that all the clinical team are involved. So that's a lot of people, all of whom have to get this right. They're the ones who are actually responsible for initiating the claim for the drug, because they need to generate an FP10 for the drugs that they're given, or they need to code System 1 or EMIS so that the drugs can be found in the clinical system. As you've already answered though, not knowing what's claimable is the start of the problem. In our experience, that yes leads to practices underclaiming, but they also underclaim because they don't claim every time. In other words, they do know what's claimable, but just don't do it. They get distracted, they don't code things correctly, or they claim the wrong item. You then have the additional problem that in order to make a profit, you need to make sure you're not paying too much, but your suppliers may be charging you more than they should, or you may be within a supplier that isn't as low cost as others. So that's going to have an effect on your profit as well. So there's all things within the practice that can impact on your income and profits. But once you've sent the claim off, the problems can continue. When your claim is processed, there may be issues in the processing. And when it goes to PCSE, there may be mistakes made there. These are all examples of mistakes that we regularly see. So if you've seen a reduction in your drug's profits, the question is, which one of these is the cause? Or more than likely, it'll be several of them. But in all the work we've done across literally thousands of practices, all of the causes of the issues are represented here. But in doing all of the work, we've come up with solutions. And I can distill the solutions down into just 3 things. But hang on, before I do, I'll just mention dispensing practices. The difference between prescribing only and dispensing, well, all of the issues I've just described apply to dispensing practices as well, but in addition, you've got other things to worry about. You've got the fact you have a dispensary, and so that's a very different business to the personally administered items. What makes it different? Well, you start with an FP10, whereas for a PA, it starts with a drug and a patient in a treatment room. So that's actually a good thing because the FP10 acts as the kind of invoice. But you've still got to worry about things like wrong movements, which continues to be a major problem for lots of dispensing practices. We are helping at this moment in time dozens of dispensing practices who've been impacted by wrong movements. You've got far more complicated supplier arrangements. And so, as Louise mentioned, some of our team are very experienced dispensary managers. When they'd worked full-time in a dispensing practice, they would spend, in some cases, the majority of their time just managing suppliers to get the best prices. But because of the volume of scripts you're processing, the split between the GPs will have a big impact as well. So there's a range of specific issues that are unique to dispensing practices, but one that also applies is the fact that the personally administered items are a fraction of your total income. And because the payment does not split them out, they're completely lost. So the PAs, which are particularly problematic, can therefore be almost, it can be invisible to you whether they're being successfully claimed or not. The solution for all practices then, dispensing and prescribing only, comes down to 3 things. The first is to make sure you claim for everything. I guess it's fairly self-evident, but there's no simple answer. It requires a range of techniques to ensure that everything is claimed correctly, both the personally administered and from the dispensary. The second then is to make sure everything is paid. Now this is rarely done, but if you don't check your payments, or if nobody checks them, nobody else will. So that's what we call revenue assurance, the process of systematically checking every month's payment. The fallback for practices is often their accountants, who will report back about the income from one year to the next. But the two issues with that are that if a problem occurs, it might take them up to 18 months before they spot that that's occurred. And the second is, particularly for a dispensing practice, well, the income can vary by tens of thousands a year, and that may be for valid reasons. So you may therefore miss that there's an issue that's also caused a big loss. So we recommend, and what we provide to our practices, is a process of checking payments every single month, because that way you'll spot things straight away. The only other thing to do is then manage your suppliers. But as I've mentioned, that's a complex task, but it will make a difference. If you do all three of these things, then you'll achieve that target profit of 25 to 30%. But they're equally important. So if you omit any one of them, that can and usually does have an impact on your profits. So what we need to do now is address each of these, and this is where my hints and tips are going to follow to address things you can do with each of them. But there's actually a fourth thing that you also need to do, and that is make full use of the quirks of the system that are in your favor. There are a few almost illogical quirks that unusually are beneficial, and I'll point out some of those to you as we go. So let's just take an example of a practice. Now, this is a real example of a practice that we worked with who came to us a while ago, a 10,000 patient prescribing only practice. Their issue was their accountants had said that they were showing a loss on their drugs. So all they knew was just that they had a certain income, but the net profit was negative. It was a loss. So we dug into it and we were able to actually split out the income by each category of drug. That's important because every drug has its own associated processes around their use, around their claims, and around the purchasing. So they each had, if you like, individual problems to solve. So that was their income, but yeah, the costs were too high. They were suffering from two problems. One was that their income was too low, and the other was that their costs were too high. Compounded together, that was why they had such a drastic negative profit. I mean, in summary, for this practice, they weren't claiming everything. Even when they were claiming they were not being paid for everything, they were over-ordering their flus, so left with wastage, and they were ordering late, so paying too much. They were being overcharged by suppliers, and they were ordering drugs that just make a loss. So it was almost a bit overwhelming. So let me now step through some of those things so that you can ask yourself whether there are things you could do that would apply to your practice. But before I do that, I need to give you the tools to allow you to analyze what's going on. So you need to know how to calculate the profit for your drugs. And you can apply this to the overall drugs, but I would recommend you apply it to each individual drug. As your accountants will tell you, there is no magic wand to increasing profits. You have to go right down to the detail and from the bottom up, take each individual item that you're purchasing and look at how you can maximize the profit on it. How do you do it? Well, every drug you purchase and claim has an associated basic price. And when you claim, that's what you're paid. But it's adjusted, it's modified by a number of factors. Firstly, a discount is taken off. Nothing you can do about it, it's just money the NHS deduct. They add back the VAT on PAIs, not dispensed drugs, but PAIs, and you get a dispensing fee on everything as well. So that's how you can calculate then the income, the payment. If you bring in the supplier cost, you can calculate the profits. There's the list of discounts. It's an amount that's deducted. It depends on the value of the claim. And for a dispensing practice, it's going to be 11.18% because of the value of your monthly claims. Prescribing only, it'll be down at 3 or 4 or 5%. And there are your dispensing fees. Prescribing only, it should be £2.45. This should be maximum because you should be managing your claims to achieve that. Dispensing, it's a lower fee, and because of the volume, you're going to be down here at £2.14 and so on. Now, there's lots of pressures on your profits, one of which is the fact that dispensing fees haven't really gone up. There are the fees over the last 9 years, and they're really pretty much where they were 9 years ago. They do fluctuate every 6 months, but if you take inflation into account, that's been a negative over the period. Okay, so now armed with that knowledge of how you can interrogate and analyze your drugs, let's look at some specific actions that you can take. Oh, hang on, I just need to tell you a bit more information. The basic price is never paid in full. It's always discounted, as I've explained. The dispensing fees change every 6 months, but probably the most important thing to take away from this is the need to manage suppliers because they're not tied to the basic price. Very often that's what they will charge, but they're not tied to that, so you cannot assume it. So checking supplier prices is this very important and time-consuming task. So with the knowledge of that payment formula, something you might have detected or picked up is that the discount is a percentage, whereas the dispensing fee is fixed. What that means is that it depends on the value of the drug, whether you end up making a profit or a loss. So I'm going to give you a little rule of thumb, which is that if you're purchasing drugs that are low cost, they're generally going to be profitable. Whereas if they're high cost, they're generally not going to be profitable. There are lots of exceptions, but let me explain why there is that general rule. £30 for a prescribing only practice is about the kind of cutover point. Because if we take this made up drug that costs £30, the cost is £30 and the basic price is £30. All right, so it's the same cost, the same basic price. Well, 6% will be deducted from that payment, so that will be taken off you. You will get VAT added back, but because you've had £1.80 taken off, the amount of VAT you're paid, £4.80, is less than the VAT that you have paid your supplier. So there's a difference there. But the dispensing fee will then compensate. So the £2.45 will then make it such that you kind of break even. But if the value of the drug were greater than £30, the formula works the other way, you'll make a loss. If it's less than £30, you'll likely make a profit. So bear that in mind when we look at some of these examples I'm going to show you. So low cost items then are fundamentally favorable because of that formula. So even if there's no discount from your supplier, if the supplier cost is similar to the basic price, you're going to make a really good profit. Now remember, when you're looking at these figures, we're aiming for a target profit of 25 to 30%. Well, look at some of the figures that are achievable here. Again, these examples are for a prescribing only practice. For dispensing, it will be similar, perhaps slightly less. Okay, but it depends for a dispensing practice whether you actually get a better discount because of the volume you're purchasing from your supplier. So in all of these examples, I've assumed that the cost is the same as the basic price, but because of the low cost per item, you get this really good profit. There's one exception, which is xylocaine. The reason that is the highest profit of all is because this is one of the quirks of the system that I mentioned. A xylocaine spray is a large vial. So a clinician, being prudent, will use the same vial for several patients. They should then do a prescription for each amount that they use, not for the whole vial, but for the amount that they've given. When you are reimbursed for that, the quirk of the system is that you will be reimbursed for the whole bottle every time, even though you've only given a partial bottle. So if one bottle is used on 5 patients, that's why the cost remains low and you get 5 lots of income, and that's why it's so profitable. It's one of the quirks. I recommend you do it. Now, lots of practices don't bother claiming these items because the cost of any of these items per patient is tiny, and so they just don't bother. But they're foregoing the profit that's available on the item. Here's another isolated example that can make a big difference. Lots of practices will be giving B12 hydroxycobalamin, but they mistakenly put the patient on a loading dose at the beginning, which they have to do. But what they'll do is say that that patient should be given 5 ampules of hydroxycobalamin. That's what the GP's prescribed. The patient then comes in quick succession for those 5 injections. But in this example, you'll make a loss on that. The reason being is that you're only going to receive 1 dispensing fee. It's also incorrect to prescribe in that way because you should be giving a prescription each time you see the patient. So what you should do is produce 5 prescriptions, 1 per visit, and then you'll be correctly paid, and you've gone from making no profit to making a profit for that loading dose of £9. The other reason I wanted to mention hydroxycobalamin, because it is an exception. The reason it's an exception is that PAIs are generally they have a basic price that is reasonably fixed. But hydroxycobalamin is known as a category M drug. And the consequence of that is the price of it changes pretty much every month. So this graph shows how the basic price of hydroxycobalamin has changed over the last few years. It really does jump around. There's nothing you can do about that, but you must make sure you keep your eye on your supplier costs, and hopefully they'll keep track with those changes in basic price. So the next thing I want to talk about is suppliers. As I mentioned before, managing suppliers is key. Lots of practices get into the habit of just going with a convenient supplier and then just assuming that the prices are about the same. I'm afraid you cannot do that. For prescribing only, your options are more limited, but you've still got the choice about which suppliers to go to. For dispensing, I'll come on to talk about that in a minute, but you've got very much more options because of the various offers that are available to you. But the basics of this are start by checking prices and compare them with the basic price of the drugs that they are selling to you. As a rule of thumb, they should be the same, or ideally there should be some supplier discount. Either way, use the information I've given you today to calculate the profit. If there isn't any profit, you've got to consider your options. Really, commercially, there's no point doing something that loses money. So you could put the patient on a prescription. They can get the drug from the pharmacist. But of course, you've got to remember the consequences of that. Is that the patient experience you want to give? It may be you've still got to purchase it because you can't get it from the pharmacist. So Viatim's a good example. There's no supplier discount. You're probably going to lose money on your Viatims, but you have to give them, so that's just a consequence. And yes, if you send a patient to the pharmacy, if that patient is not exempt from prescription charges, they'll have to pay a prescription charge, and I doubt they're going to be happy about that. Either way, you're making informed decisions about how and whether you're making a profit on each of the drugs. So yeah, remember, low-cost drugs generally profitable, providing you claim for them. High-cost drugs we need to look at in more detail because generally they're not going to be profitable unless a supplier discount applies. Another thing we regularly see is a practice switching to an alternative supplier when there's a stock shortage. And that alternative supplier is very convenient, and so they just stick with that alternative supplier. You need to be careful not to do that. I mean, some of the reasons these things occur are that the people in the practice, they're different. So the person who does the purchasing often doesn't see the invoices, so doesn't really know what the costs are. And then the person with the invoices doesn't get involved with the FP34 claims, so they don't know what the reimbursements are. So this information is spread around the practice and nobody's pulling it all together. So really my suggestion is, in your practice, pull these bits of information together to understand what's happening on a drug-by-drug basis. So let's now look at some of the high-cost drugs, which, again, I've been saying, be careful, you might lose money. Well, Nebido is a good example. The basic price of a Nebido is £87.11. Generally, the supplier cost is around the same. And at that cost, you will not make any profit. Now, of course, if you can get a better price than that, it'll make a difference. So Xgeva, here's an example of Xgeva, which is a very expensive drug, but you should be able to get some supplier discount. So if, for example, it was £282 compared with the basic price of £310, well, that's brought it back into being profitable again. Only 7%, but still, it's a profit. So in this example, you would purchase Xgeva, but you might choose for any patients who need Nebido to give them a prescription to take to the pharmacy. Again, remember our target here is to achieve 25 to 30% profit margin. Well, we're not quite doing that with those, but let's move on to the GnRH drugs. For example, Prostat and Zoladex. Now, there's competition between the suppliers. Your GPs can switch a patient from one drug to another, and the suppliers know that. So they are giving, at the moment, very good discounts. So those are the target prices. So I would recommend you check what you're paying for these drugs. If it's nothing like that, then there is a potential to get a better price. But look at the profit margin you're making and the value, and this is per injection. Now, these patients you'll probably see 4 times a year. So you're potentially making up to £400 a profit per patient per year on just this one drug. So again, my message remains to reiterate, please check your costs and your basic prices and calculate the profit. So let's look at another high cost drug, which is often one that practices get wrong. So they don't purchase Mirina's because it's a high cost drug. So they think, okay, I won't buy that because, yeah, I'm going to lose money. And the calculation here is that it shows a loss of £4. However, that is wrong. The reason practices think that they're going to lose money is they're overlooking the fact that Mirena is a contraception. So what that means is that the cost, the VAT on the cost isn't 20%, it's 5%. So it's not £106 that you pay, it's actually only £92.40. The reimbursement, because it's a personally administered item, includes a VAT allowance. And this is another quirk of the system. Let's embrace it. The VAT allowance is 20% on everything that's a PAI, even though the VAT you pay is only 5%. So now you're actually going to make a profit. So, yep, again, you've got a choice, but if you choose to purchase it, make sure you're paying no more than £88, and yeah, you will make a reasonable profit. Okay, so now we're going to come on to the most valuable drug of all for any practice, and that includes dispensing practices as well, and that is your flus. So I could spend well over an hour talking about flus, so I'm going to rattle through this. It's so important because for a prescribing only practice, the flus can make up to half your income for the year. Again, it's another example where profits are down. The profits on flus used to be 40–50%. The best you can hope to achieve now is 20 to 25%, but still worthwhile because of the value of the flus overall. Plus, of course, you get a £10 and 6p service fee for every jab as well. So you make a profit on the reimbursement and you get the enhanced service fee as well. So to achieve this kind of profit, then you've got to get it right. And unfortunately, because of the amount of money that's involved, if you don't get it right, you can make a loss quite quickly. Order your flus early. That's how you get the best price. The later you order, the less discount you're going to see. Be very careful when reviewing quotes from different suppliers. For some reason, they always confidently give you a projection of the profits, but they always get it wrong. So you need to do your own calculation. The error they seem to make is to omit the NHS discount. So for a dispensing practice, that can be 11.18%, and they omit that. So their profits are enhanced by 11.18%. So do your own calculation. And of course, bear in mind that that percentage applies more to a more expensive vaccine compared to a cheaper one. Right, here we are in September now, about to start the flu season. So you need to get the whole practice geared up to delivering those flus. I recommend that you run a weekly usage report. Now, let me explain why. You don't have any way of checking your flus because you don't have any FP10s. You're relying on the clinical system being coded correctly so that when you run the report to report the number of flus, it gives you a number. you really want to have something you can compare that to. Stock takes and stock checks are not normally something I would recommend. I would not normally recommend them because it's another process that can also suffer from errors. However, the exception are your flues, because you need that cross-check. So here's what I recommend you do. Develop a little spreadsheet in which you track the stock of your flues. Record the opening stock. Well, at the start of the season, it's 0. Then add in the deliveries. Then at the end of each period, so each week, take another stock check and record the closing stock. That will tell you from a stock perspective how many of you've used. And the reason I'm saying do it weekly is because it's only a relatively short period in which you're giving hundreds of flues. So you want to be able to keep track of it week to week in case something goes wrong. You can then compare that with your CQRS search and your flu search for your reimbursements, and they should all agree. Okay, there may be small variances, I wouldn't worry about that, but if they're all agreeing, that gives you confidence that you are claiming all of your flues. Make sure that these stock checks, the timing of them is really precise because it has to coincide with your searches. Be very careful of, for example, a Saturday flu clinic, because you might do some things on a Friday and some things on a Monday and think, oh, well, Monday's the next day, it'll be the same. But if you did your stock check on a Friday, then you had a Saturday flu clinic, then you do the CQRS search on a Monday, it's all going to go haywire. And that's why I do not generally recommend stock checks. They're really complicated to do. But with flus, because of the value at stake, it's really important to do it. As I mentioned, during the flu season, make sure everybody is involved and targeted with reaching your patients. Any patient who comes to the practice should be offered the flu if they're eligible. You should proactively contact them all. You've got to manage that stock to make sure you're not left with any wastage. And then after the flu campaigns, make sure you track the payments. That's revenue assurance, which I'm going to talk about, but it's vitally important to check that all of your flus are actually paid. So there are some examples now of the kind of profits you can make on your flus. These are recent prices for Seqirus and Sanofi, and it shows that 25% profit margin. Now, Sanofi is quite curious because they had to, with very little notice, withdraw their QIVR vaccine. So the only one available is the QIV HD, which is a new vaccine. The profit per item is very similar. So you might think, well, does it make much difference whether I buy Sanofi or Seqirus? But because of the high cost, it means two things. Firstly, the profit margin is lower. But secondly, if you are left with any wastage, the cost of that is going to be much greater. So one wasted Sanofi flu, you're going to lose £21, whereas if it was a Seqirus, you're only losing £10. So just bear that in mind when you're considering which flus to purchase. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the third topic, which is about revenue assurance. So far we've been talking about claiming for everything and for purchase things at the right price to make sure they're profitable. But of course, we've got to make sure you are actually paid the money you're expecting. So to recap, these are the range of issues that we regularly see. You may have been impacted by some, but very often, if you have, you may not even notice, because you get this concept of revenue leakage, just a small amount of money going missing that you just don't notice, but it will just recur. But we have seen in the past dispensing fees not paid, no particular explanation, just randomly not paid. Not all the items paid. The pooled list issue, it affected many, many practices. The list goes on. So the role of revenue assurance then is to proactively and systematically check the payments compared with the claims. Now, it's quite difficult to do because, well, we've seen the drug statement, it just has an amount of money on it. Well, the key for a prescribing only practice is to forecast what you're going to be paid. And it's quite possible to have a clever calculator, and this is the one that we provide to our practices, that does exactly that. It's got the basic prices. They are updated every month, but that's fine. It knows what they are. It can calculate the payment, and it can also calculate the profit as well. But just focusing on the payment then, this is the basis of financial control. The ability to predict how much you're going to be paid and then checking what you are paid. So that's fine, and there are various ways of doing it. But where practices often become unstuck is even if they do this, they've got to do it every month. It often doesn't happen. But when something does go wrong, that's where the problems really start, because now you've got to work out why you've been underpaid, what's caused it, and how do you go about fixing it. So that because it's relatively unusual, that can often be where practices get stuck. So this is the basis of the Compass service that I mentioned earlier, but the principle of it is something that you should all adopt. For a dispensing practice, it's much more complicated because it's impossible to calculate the amount you're going to be paid. So there are other things you can do, and the service we provide for dispensing practices looks at the whole dispensary. You can't separate out the PAIs because they're paid along with the dispensary. So that's the principle of revenue assurance, and often it's not done at all, but we regularly find payment issues that have just gone undiagnosed. But because you claim every single month, you just never know when some new issue is going to affect you. And all I can say is in the 10 years we've been doing this, the number of payment errors we see goes up year on year. And it's just down to changes in the NHS, things becoming less reliable, the knowledge in the NHS really kind of getting worse as time goes by. So it really is incumbent on you as the practice to make sure you check to know that you've been paid correctly. I'm now going to talk specifically about dispensing practices and the additional things that can affect your profits in relation to your drugs. So everything I've said so far applies to everybody. But for dispensing practices, there's so much more you need to worry about, and the values are so much greater because it applies to your whole dispensary, and it could be £1 million of revenue. Supplier management is crucial, and many drugs are now above the tariff. I've said that if they're at tariff, that's about right, but many increasingly are above tariff. The MDS deals that have been available, they're just fewer and fewer, so just make sure you check and sign up to all that are available. Do consider using short-line wholesalers. It takes more work, but for the high volume drugs, it's definitely worth doing and big savings are possible. High value drugs, treat with care. As I mentioned, make sure you understand whether they're profitable or not. Wrong movements, constant vigilance is required. It's worrying because there's no way of recovering the money, but please check every month. Look to spread your scripts between all of your GPs to maximize your dispensing fees. And don't forget to keep a lid on, or keep the costs on sundry items as low as possible. Shop around. Just things like the bags you use and so on can make a big difference. PAIs, yeah, just as important, but they do require a separate focus. And revenue assurance is just as important for the dispensary as it is for the PAIs. But with the increased pressure on your resources, that can often result in you just spending less time managing suppliers. So do please recognize the value of this activity, and try and make time available to the dispensary team to be able to do this. I'm going to leave time for questions, so I'll wrap up now with a summary. I mean, I've really rattled through this, so I hope you've got your questions ready for me, because I want to go back and make sure I've not sort of been too quick on some of those points. In summary then, reimbursable drugs are generally profitable. There's only a tiny number that are not, but make sure you know which they are. The profits are not as great, but you're aiming for 30%. Flus are particularly important, so please spend time making sure you thoroughly understand the business model behind your flus. As you've probably picked up, there are so many pitfalls that can apply to each of the different categories of drug. So yeah, just constant vigilance is required. And please consider revenue assurance as an activity within the practice. You just cannot assume that you are being paid correctly. If you're not, you need to be able to spot it quickly, and then you need to know how to go about fixing it. And just remember the golden rules. Do what you can to ensure that everything is claimed, and have the confidence that you have claimed everything and not lost anything. Make sure you check that everything has been paid, and then manage your suppliers. If you do those three, then you will achieve those levels of profit. And remember, of course, we can help. That's what we're doing for over 300 practices, supporting their claims every month. So thank you. I hope that's been useful. I feel I've gone quite quickly. So yeah, please, Harriet, have you been able to keep an eye on any questions? Perhaps there are none, but let me know what questions there are.
Yep, we've got a couple of questions. So I will just pass them over to you, Rich. The first one is, are dispensing fees for non-dispensing practices the same as the professional fees in the invoice that you showed to the PCSE drug statement?
Yep, absolutely. Professional fees, as is shown on the drug statement, is the same as the dispensing fees, yes.
Great, thank you. Next question is about central supply. So should we claim things ordered through the NHS supply chain that are free?
Really good question. Informed drugs, central supplies, do not claim. Anything, well, in fact, the rule is anything you haven't purchased, do not claim. So what's important to note about that is you need to know where you obtain the drugs. Often the person doing the claim doesn't necessarily get involved with purchasing, so may not know that these drugs are obtained for free. So unfortunately, that also means you don't get a dispensing fee. It's just the way it is. So yeah, do not claim anything you haven't purchased. Now, there's a flip side. You may need to use some of these drugs on people who are not eligible, in which case you should purchase and claim. RSV is a new vaccine that's just come out. That's got a specific cohort. You'll obtain it for free from Inform, you won't claim. But for those that are outside of the cohort, you should. Revaxis is another example. It's on here, but it's on here for school leavers. But if you give a Revaxis to someone for travel purposes that's an adult, well, you can't use the free ones. They're not in the cohort. So you can purchase it and claim. But you can imagine now how complicated this can get for nurses. They've got two sources of Revaxis and two different cohorts, and I've seen it where they got it wrong in every possible way. With Revaxis, keep it simple. Have two supplies clearly labeled, aged up to 20, use the Inform stock, no prescription required, do not claim. Aged over 20, use the purchase stock, raise a prescription and claim.
Thank you. I can't see any other questions in the question box at the moment. So if anybody does have any that they'd like to add, then feel free to do so now.
Yeah, please, as I say, thank you for taking the time to listen to me rabbiting on, but please get from this whatever you want to ensure you can take this away. And Louise, I will provide these slides. So if you're able to make them available to everybody to refer to, we'll do that. The aim, as I say, really that you can act upon some of these things. Or if, as I've been talking, you've been confident you're doing all these things, that's great. It's kind of an endorsement that you're doing things correctly.
Thank you both. Yes, a couple of people had asked, but we will obviously share the recording. So please just keep an eye out for an email from Larkin Gowan, but we'll send sort of a separate copy of the slides round if need be. But yeah, it doesn't look like there are any questions. You've clearly either just done such a good job that everyone now is an expert, or they're just waiting to bombard you individually with any individual questions they may have. So I think if there are no other questions, and you both, Richard and Harriet, have covered off everything, if you have any last parting words, but otherwise I'll just say thank you both. I found that really useful, certainly, and I think it's just really good to have a refresher as often as we possibly can. And do you go out and do training for practices, for new staff members and things like that? I'm assuming that's something you can offer.
The main thing we provide is this Compass service, which is an ongoing support for practices, because staying on top of this is just such a lot of work, and it's only something that you do once every month. So you're only doing this 12 times a year. So that includes the support of our team and training, so that as you've got staff changes and so on, you've always got the ability to maintain that level of knowledge. It's a very common problem we see is when there are staff changes, things kind of drift downhill, because even with a good handover, we just don't see it effectively happens. So that's one option. But also on our website, we do provide webinars where I go into much more detail about how to generate the FP34 submission. So if that's something you're interested in, you can get details from our website, ashlane.co.uk.
Perfect, thank you. Right, well, I think we're 5 minutes early, but I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully you've all taken away some really great tips. And thank you both to Richard and Harriet for that really useful session.
No, thank you, Louise, and thanks everybody. And yeah, feel free to get in touch if there's anything else we can help with.